I am really pleased to introduce Jamie Starr. Jamie's from the People History Museum and will be telling us we have always been here, highlighting marginalised voices in permanent collections. Please give them a warm welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for joining me. So, as Jamie mentioned, I am also Jamie. I'm a public historian and heritage practitioner, and my focus is on LGBTQIA activist histories in the UK and HIV history, and primarily with a UK focus as well. My practice focuses on oral history and unearthing hidden and marginalised stories, and also using research that I conducted on my master's to consult with heritage organisations and museums about how to access marginalised audiences who don't feel included in heritage spaces. I also am very proud to work at People's History Museum. I'm a collections assistant there, and I am going to be talking about the work that we've done there to engage LGBTQIA audiences within our permanent collections. The way I'm going to run this session is I'm going to give you a little bit of background as to why this is important, some information about terminology, and kind of the history of why we are where we are in the sector. And then I'm going to talk about how we curated the tours in the galleries without adding objects. And then if I do this right, there should be time at the end for questions and troubleshooting. So have a think about if you're in an organisation that's already doing this work and you kind of want to troubleshoot something or bounce ideas off people in the room, this is a space to do that. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. And I will be hanging around afterwards if you want to ask questions privately as well. So, a little bit of background. If you are not familiar with the People's History Museum, you're missing out. We are located in Manchester. We are the Museum of Democracy and Protest, and we cover political history from around the 1700s to the present day. Our objects include badges, textiles, placards, paper ephemera, and we have two main permanent galleries, which are split by time period and theme. So Gallery 1 contains everything from the Industrial Revolution until the end of Second World War, and Gallery 2 is everything post-1945, so formation of the welfare state, late 20th century strike and protest history, and the development of equal rights campaigns for people of colour, migrants, disabled people, and queer people. So before I really jump into talking about the development work that we've done and how you can apply similar practices in your organisations, I wanted to make a comment about terminology, because when I do engage with audiences on this work, I never assume knowledge of terminology, even really basic terminology that if you're in the community, you might have to bear with me for a minute, because I want us to all access this on an equal footing. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be using LGBTQIA or queer as umbrella terms, and that tends to be my practice unless I'm speaking about a real person or group with a known identity, at which point I defer to self-described terms, of course. And LGBTQIA plus stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual, and it's considered a most inclusive term by much of the community, as it's the broadest selection of identities included within it. Different organisations phrase this differently. Some might say LGBT, LGBTQ, some might add a plus onto either of those to indicate that everyone else is included within them. Other organisations like Queer Britain use the word queer as a catch-all. Queer Britain, if you don't know about it, is the first bricks and mortar queer museum in the UK. And there's sometimes pushback from audiences about the word queer, as it's a reclaimed slur, but it's been reclaimed for quite some time, and it's used in the mainstream. And as anyone who went to school in the 2000s can tell you, any identity term can be used as a slur. So I tend to be comfortable with that. Me using it does not mean you have to use it about yourself or your audiences. And sorry, my notes are a little bit fiddly. The reason I'm bringing up the terminology is because you might get pushback about what term you use, no matter what term you use. So some people might push back against LGBTQIA because they feel it's ahistorical, or because they dispute the inclusion of certain communities within that term. Others might dispute the word queer because they have a painful history with it. And really, I wanted to make it clear that there is no right answer. The right answer is have a consistent policy. So if you do get comments about this or questions or someone being upset because it impacts their trauma history, you are able to have a conversation with them and make sure that all of your staff know that policy, so that they feel empowered to have these conversations independently as well. If you want to learn more about defining specific terms or figuring out which terms suit your organization, I really recommend the fantastically named Homosaurus, which is a glam industry thesaurus of queer terminology, and it contains most commonly understood meanings of each word and why they get used, as well as connected terms to each of them. And that's available online if you want to have a look at it. Also, this is getting a little bit niche, but I wanted to talk a little bit about policy history. So why don't we have more queer history objects in the majority of museum collections? Like other marginalised groups in previous generations, societal attitude meant that our material culture wasn't typically viewed as worth collecting, unless it was linked to a very famous person who could be discussed, a celebrity who had a career that wasn't based around their sexuality or their marginalised identity, and it could be talked about without mentioning that. The page that I've got on the screen is from an object that we've got in our collection. It's a guide that was published by the Greater London Council in 1985. And it's a charter of rights that LGBT people could expect in council-provided services. And it says that schools and heritage organisations have a duty to be honest and unbiased when they teach topics that interact with queer history. They explicitly mention the British Library, the Tate, the British Museum, and all of the galleries and museums supported by local authorities should, quote, amend their exhibition policies and guidebooks so that the achievements and sufferings of lesbians and gay men, both living and dead, are fully recognised. And that was 1985. So local authorities were starting to become aware of their duty of care towards our communities. 3 years later, the Conservative government brings in Section 28, which prohibits organisations receiving local authority funding from talking about homosexuality, promoting homosexuality as a, quote, pretended family relationship. And usually when we talk about Section 28 and its impact, which I know was discussed in Queer Britain's session earlier, which some of this is going to be echoing what they've said, and it's because it's important rather than because I don't think they covered it properly or anything like that. As they said earlier, this is usually thought about in its impact on school children and education staff, but it also impacted the heritage industry. Museums that received local authority funding couldn't produce exhibitions that talked about queerness, or they would risk losing their funding. And museums that relied on school trips, for instance, and for some of their income, would also choose to self-censor even if they weren't local authority funded, because if a school couldn't come there because it was talking positively about queer people, they would lose that money from the school trips. So between 1988 and 2003, when it was repealed in England and Wales, it was repealed in Scotland in 2000, we have this culture of silence. The government has essentially censored the heritage industry as well as schools, and that still impacts people today, both as people who lived in the climate under Section 28 and were harmed by that, but also our collections were damaged by it, because if you couldn't put these things on display, you couldn't talk about them, why would you collect them? So there are gaps, and I talk about this with our visitors when I do our queer history tours. I think it's really important to do this, to be honest and open about why we are the way we are as an industry, because once we open that door and we uncover that opaque little curtain that sort of says, here's why we don't have these objects, people are willing to give us more grace about explaining why we are catching up, essentially, because that's what we're doing. We are catching up on all of the absences that were caused by this period. So that's my first big piece of advice. It feels embarrassing and awkward sometimes, but statements like that about prior practice tells your audience that we are now on a journey to do better, and they want to go on that journey with us, with you. So it's a brave statement to make. It might feel uncomfortable, but I really encourage you to make it. So coming to the present day, People's History Museum, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have tried before and how it's worked, and then I'll explain why we introduced the tours as an additional part of our interpretation. If the clicker will work. There we go. So on permanent display in Gallery 2, we have an equalities case which has a range of queer history objects in it. And this is the dedicated gathering point in the gallery for discussing the struggle for queer rights in the UK. And it spans the work that churches in Manchester did pre-decriminalisation in the 1960s to appeal for decriminalisation. It covers the massive anti-Section 28 march in Manchester, the Never Going Underground march in the 80s, outrages, protests in the 90s, right through to the present day, where we have trans representation through a gender recognition certificate, which was donated to us, and a range of badges and objects from communities within the queer umbrella. So we've got an asexual pride badge on display, for instance, and a genderqueer pride badge, which are interpreted, and we explain what those are. And those are sort of quite up to date compared to, and it shows the transition of terminology as well, which is an important conversation to have with visitors who might not always know why we use the terms we use and what terms we used before, and see the links between them. We also do a lot of temporary displays. We have a Changing Banners exhibition. Our banner hang happens every January, and typically there are a few queer banners within what goes up. Currently we've got the LGSM banner on display for 2025. And I also co-curated a temporary exhibition during Pride Month to coincide with a sold-out evening in conversation with Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors members, Jonathan Blake and Mike Jackson, which was a brilliant opportunity to also put out lesser-seen objects from the LGSM collection, which we hold at the museum. We also had the huge Never Going Underground exhibition in 2017 for the 50th anniversary of decriminalisation. And in our temporary exhibitions, which aren't specifically about queer history, we also make sure that we curate on queer topics. So our Nothing About Us Without Us Disabled History exhibition in 2023 included curation of disabled queer history. We had this beautiful intersex disabled pride flag that had been made by a community co-curator, and so we make sure that these stories are woven through all of our temporary exhibitions. As part of the legacy of Never Going Underground, we also have context labels in the galleries that give additional stories that aren't necessarily related to an object on display, but they're related to the theme of the gallery area that they're located in. So the stories they tell are really interesting, but legacy projects like this, sometimes visitors get a little confused as they try to find the object connected to it when there might not necessarily be one. So without staff interpretation to explain what they are, these can be a little bit more trouble than if they were connected directly to an object. But where you don't have objects, we can do something else, which I'm going to talk about now. So we curated LGBTQIA plus tours. Myself and two visitor experience staff members, Hattie and Kaylee, expressed a desire to lead queer history tours for Pride Month in 2024. And from that, I created permanently available to staff to put on if they have the time and the confidence to deliver tours. We have this permanent tour available of our hidden history, our queer hidden history within our permanent collection. And here's how we went about making that. So part one, desk work, research. We identified what key terminology we wanted to use. So if you were trying to do this for disabled history rather than queer history, you might want to think about terms that are used now. And this is also applicable to queer history, but I'm using a different example. Terms that are used now, terms that were used 50 years ago, even ones that may be harmful and not used now that were seen as the norm at the point in time where these objects might have been collected. You need to identify your target audience, and if it's the community itself, you might want to tell a more complex story. If you're assuming sort of a broader audience that might have people who aren't connected but are interested, you want to assume sort of an advanced beginner level of knowledge. So you can be comfortable explaining things, but you're not starting with LGBT 101 or Disability 101, but you're prepared to jump in and clarify a term if someone asks for it. You then need to audit your collection for relevant items, obviously, on and off display. So when we did this, we audited our collection and we found that there have been 29 different sexuality-related terms that had been used over the course of our use of digital cataloguing software, and that covered 159 objects. Now, we know there are more objects that have queer connections, but they weren't tagged as such at the time when they were accessioned for various reasons. And our collection includes the Gaze the Word co-founder Ernest Hole's badge collection, the LGSM and Mark Ashton Trust objects, Peter Tatchell's political campaigning material, and now we've found what we know we have gone through and re-tagged all of those objects. So our tagging system is now we use LGBTQIA as the first tag, and then if we know a person's identity, so if someone was a gay man and we've got an object from them, we will have gay as a secondary tag. So we're not erasing identities, but there is a collective umbrella term that we've agreed on above that. And we're also adding a note to our online collection portal for visitors, so they can access these object records with a parity of ease to how staff would find them. So we'll explain this is how we tag stuff. If you want to go and find asexual related objects, you can put in LGBTQA and asexual, and then they get exactly what we can find. So they don't need to contact us. They don't need to rely on staff gatekeeping access. And that's really important to us. You can also, if you have this, and you might not, but if you have previous intervention records, if you might be able to look at those and see what's still relevant to your collection, to your displays. So during Never Underground, our then curator, Catherine O'Donnell, had done tours that she'd worked on with community groups and academic advisors to tailor to what was on display. Some of that stuff is no longer there, so when we were doing our initial research, we had a look around and we saw this stuff's still on display, this is relevant to what we want to include, and we factored in those objects. And it was a really helpful jumping off point. But if you don't have those, it's also okay. You can start from scratch. It just takes more time. Once you've done your back of house research, you can move on to the galleries. And it's okay if you don't find objects in the back of house research. I will tell you how to work with that in a second. But you walk the galleries. It's that simple. Whoever's going to be involved in producing the tours, have a look at the galleries like a visitor would. What stories do they tell? And how can a marginalised voice be unearthed within those stories? It might not be a direct, we have an object from this disabled activist. It might be, we're an industrial collection and disabled people were often disabled at work during the Industrial Revolution. So we can talk about disabled workers through our industrial history collection, for instance. Obviously, we identify if there are objects on display that are relevant and have been curated with the queer history that people know about. We identify gaps, sections of the museum that don't have any objects, and we think about what we want to do with those. And within those sections, we think about bridge objects, which I call them those. They're sort of objects, like I say, that aren't necessarily directly connected, but something that can draw a visual focus when you pause to tell a story. And you also need to be honest in your script, if you're writing a script for your tours. Why are there gaps? As I've discussed, we talk about section 28, but we also talk about how we laid out the galleries and how we're addressing those gaps. if you know that you have audited your collection and you have not got very much from a local faith minority a local faith minority or disabled people or queer people, you might acknowledge that to your audience and sort of say, but we are actively collecting. Don't tell them things that you're going to do in the future unless you've already committed to them. But if you know that you're going to be collecting on marginalised histories to make up for those gaps, tell them. They want to know, and they will likely be able to share that with people who can help with curating your collection by donating things, which is always helpful. So I told you I'd talk about gaps and how to talk about histories where we don't have the objects. So in our two galleries, when we initially developed the tour, we had 9 cases or banner slots across 2 floors, which had identifiable queer objects in them. And that left a huge amount of space where we didn't. Particularly in Gallery 1, as I said, that's pre-World War II. So criminalized history, people would have either destroyed their records themselves or their families destroyed them because they didn't want to be connected to queer histories. You've got other intersecting discrimination where it's not viewed as desirable to collect from disabled people, from people of color, from migrants, because we're seen as lesser. And that's not a judgment on the industry now. It's a statement of fact about how collecting happened in the Great Man era, basically. But what do we do in the gaps? So in our Industrial Revolution section, I know we don't have any objects. So what I do there is I look at what we do have and I talk about how the Industrial Revolution solidified gender roles and how urbanization and that solidification of gender roles together might have led more people to chafe against their perceived heterosexuality or to understand their gender differently. If you now have a very solid idea of what a woman is and what a woman does and how marriage works and the division of labor within that, that might be a point where you go, maybe I'm not a woman, maybe I'm not meant to be in a marriage with a man. And that's a jumping off point for talking about gender norms and how they work today. I also talk about empire in this section, and that's something that's really vital to do. If you're talking about queer communities, and we're talking about communities now, later on, acknowledge the history of queer people of colour all the way through. As a mixed race person, I can't tell you how much I want to hear those stories in pre-Windrush displays. So when we get to our suffragette section, we don't have anything about queer suffragettes of colour, but we have a portrait of Sophia Dalip Singh, and her sister, we know, was a queer woman and was active in saving Jews during the Holocaust with her partner. And I can tell that story when I talk about them, and I can talk about how their interaction with gender and sexuality was impacted by their positionality as colonized women from a royal family. There's so many different kinds of stories you can tell with these bridging objects. Within sort of pre-20th century histories, we can talk about molly houses. We have a section about the Peterloo Massacre, and I use that to talk about the history of policing. But when I talk about the history of policing, I talk about joy related to it. So I don't just say this was the point at which the police system was solidified, and that's how queer people were harmed going forward because the police obviously persecuted queer people. I talk about the Hume drag ball and the joy that was found in that before those people were arrested. It's really important to bring joy into it, and I know that was said at this morning's session as well. We can't just talk about trauma. And often with objects where we're able to see queer histories in pre-decriminalisation eras, those are connected to criminalisation and to state records of harm. So you need to think about how you display those and how you talk about those. And gaps are also a really good place to take questions and create conversation between tour participants. So at the suffragette section, and I'm actually going to, if you feel comfortable doing this, I'm going to do this now. If you went to a school within the UK, can you raise your hand if you learned about the suffragettes? Okay, so a lot of people in the room are raising their hands. can you raise your hand again if you were told that there are records that tell us that Christabel Pankhurst and some of the other leading suffragettes like Annie Kenney were queer women? Okay, just in case anyone's watching this later, no one has their hand up. And that's really typical, even in a post-Section 28 world. And I use that as a jumping off point to talk about, does it matter? Why don't, if we're learning about suffragettes in school and we don't get told that they're queer, does it matter? And there's not a right answer to this, but it's a place for people to talk. And we think about how suffragettes' queerness and perceived queerness was used as a way to punish them by the press for fighting for their rights. So I can also follow it up with a question about, does it matter if we're taught about them being accused of being queer as a punishment, but we're not taught about the love and joy that they found with each other as actual queer people? And I will say that in this space, when we get to this section, it's a really good jumping off point for conversations. And it's also, by this point, people have started engaging, they've started laughing when I tell jokes, they've started, maybe, if they're kind, they, like you, thank you. And they're sort of moving from active listening to participating, because often here you get mostly queer women or people that were raised as women thinking about what it would have been like as a young queer person, a young queer woman, to know that the suffragettes were queer. And those disclosures, those conversations, they often lead to people being way more engaged with each other, and it becomes a participatory event rather than just people listening to me talk. And it's beautiful, and it's an act of community building, and that's ultimately something that we really want to do when we're engaging with a new audience who hasn't felt included. We want them to feel like part of the conversation, not just a consumer. We do have objects on display. Their curation varies between explicitly stating that someone is queer on the object label or not, depending on why the object is there and what the story is about them. So I'll just jump on two of these. So we've got a portrait of Mary Wollstonecraft, who by modern terms was probably bisexual. We know she had relationships with women. She's mother of Mary Shelley, who also had relationships with men and women. So science fiction is bisexual. And we talk about that, and it's beautiful. And we can talk there about how women in the 1700s and 1800s who were queer flew under the radar in ways that queer men wouldn't and couldn't, because two women living together, like Mary Wollstonecraft and her partner Fanny Blood did, they could be dismissed as an emotional connection rather than crime. We also stop at the Labour Party case to talk about Albert Victor Grayson, who's the black and white photo on the right of the screen. He was a queer socialist politician from Merseyside who vanished mysteriously in 1920 after accusing the Prime Minister of selling honours for cash. And fairly recently, everyone loves that story on the tours because it sounds like a true crime podcast and it gets a lot of engagement. But fairly recently, his letters to his lover Henry Dawson were rediscovered, and they're really romantic and beautiful. And telling people about that rediscovery also humanises us as an industry. It allows me to explain that research is continuous, that we don't think we know everything, that if someone comes to us and says, well, actually, I know this new fact that you haven't included in your interpretation, we do include it. And again, that's trust building with an audience that has not had a lot of reason to trust us as an industry. So that's kind of how we work with the tours. I'm going to talk a little bit about our process with kind of what we learned as we were doing these. So research takes time. That feels like an obvious thing, but a lot of times in a lot of institutions, not in this experience because we actually did get staff hours allocated to this, but typically it's going to be a queer staff member or a disabled staff member or a staff member who's a person of colour who goes, this is missing, I'm going to fix this by giving labour that is on top of my normal role. And that is exhausting. And often, if you're engaging with the history of people that have been criminalised or brutalised by the state or brutalised by their communities, it's going to be traumatising for the staff member, and they're doing it unsupported. So if you want to do this kind of work, you have to allocate staff hours. and check in with people who are doing this research. If you're in management and someone says, I want to run a tour, I'm going to go off and do the research for it, check in with them. Even if they haven't said this, they found something upsetting. They might not use the upsetting stuff in their tour, but they're going to come across it. Script notes need to be detailed enough that they can be passed on if staff leave or if other staff want to join in with taking the tours. We've had some members of our visitor experience team who, after having been on the tours, we conducted them for staff once as a trial, and it was really lovely. And some of the VE team have sort of expressed an interest in running them themselves, but they need the notes. And I don't know about you, but when I write my notes for a talk, they make sense to me. They might not make sense to everybody else. And you're building a legacy, so once a staff member who's built it leaves, the tour is not going to die with them, so you're not then shutting out that audience after you promised them that you've started engaging with them. Audience numbers are typically stronger when tied to anniversary dates, so our tours during Pride Month, around Manchester Pride itself, during LGBT History Month, those tended to do better than sort of at other points during the year. We've always had people come to them no matter when they are. But again, if you're open weekends and weekdays, I would encourage you to do a mix of tours at those times, because putting all of your marginalised community content in one of those time slots or the other, it's going to exclude people. You know, Museum Association, we had a talk last week that someone mentioned, if all of your disabled community content is at 10 o'clock in the morning, you're going to exclude people who work. For one thing, there's an assumption that we don't work and that we can just go to a museum on Wednesday morning and not miss out on anything else in our lives, but also communities that have access needs around care in their homes to get out and get ready, that's going to exclude people. So yeah, put things at a variety of times and times throughout the year. So it's not just, well, you missed the one day that we do queer history, come back next year. Because that's a real point of broken trust when I do research with queer communities around why they don't engage with heritage in Manchester. They don't hear about things until the last minute, and then it's gone, and then there's often a feeling that they've been dropped for a year until next time LGBT History Month comes around. It's kind of, there's a lot of cynicism about why are we engaging, and that's something that the audience is going to challenge you on, especially if your organisation hasn't been involved with that community before. Why now? And that's where that radical honesty that I talked about earlier comes in really, really handy. If you tell them, we haven't engaged for these reasons, they're going to take you at face value, and they're going to want to help you grow going forward. Communities that have been historically excluded from museums and heritage will need to be approached in different ways. So if you usually advertise your programming through your own newsletter, people aren't going to be on that. You need to go to the communities themselves, and that's where marketing comes in. So when we were curating our LGSM events and our tours, we have engaged with local queer radio and community groups. And community groups tend to have their own mailing lists. If you know about community press for other marginalised communities in your area, or nationally is also good. People will travel if it's something for a community that is underserved. They will travel for it. We had people for one of our archive and tour open days during History Month this year. We had people come from London. We had people come from Durham for a 1-hour interview with LGSM. You know, people will come if you build it. It's really true. Community centres that aren't specific to the community but are in areas where you know that a lot of people from a marginalised community live, those are also useful. And again, tend to be really keen to share stuff from heritage because it's not something that underserved and deprived communities are offered very often. Also, and this one I think is a bit more queer specific, we got a lot of engagement when we went to some of the nightclubs in the Manchester Gay Village have community notice boards in them. And I went and I asked, can we put up signs about our tours? And I know that we got people from them because I know the people, and they said that's where I saw it. it is going to feel a little weird, you know, going into a nightclub, particularly like some of these nightclubs were a bit racy, and going in and sticking up something from a museum that also has family audiences. It might feel a little bit tense at first, but that's actually, family audiences is something I haven't put on here. Think about your content warnings and your age ratings. There is no reason that marginalised heritage needs to be just for adults. And in fact, like, I'm going to just say that is actively bad practice. Queer kids exist, disabled kids exist. Even if are things on display that are, you know, a little bit that would need interpretation because they are more aimed at adults, that doesn't mean that children and young people shouldn't be allowed access to their culture. Kids go to art museums all the time and see nudes. It doesn't matter that these are queer nudes, is the one example that I will give. But there is no reason that queer children and queer youth groups shouldn't be invited to your queer programming, and the same goes for other communities too. But I feel like queerness is one where people have a real nervousness about age restriction. So that is pretty much everything I can think of to tell you. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to ask questions, please feel free. If you want to contact me further, like, I can give you my card or my email is on here. And yeah, thank you so much. And I really hope that this leads to a change in practice around how we engage with our galleries. So thank you.
Fantastic talk. So we've got some time for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, if you can. Just come in.
Hi, thanks so much for that. I was just wondering about regarding like the Section 28 impacts, right? How can we explain what happened since 2003 and how, to be honest, I don't think I saw any queer representation in museums until the 50th anniversary of decriminalisation in 2017. How about those 14 years in between and, you know, still catching up since? How would you recommend explaining that to audiences?
Sorry, no, I forgot. That's a really great question, and actually this was the topic of my MA thesis, so I can definitely talk to you more about this later as well. But in brief, fear, that's the big thing. So you have to, there wasn't like a switch off overnight when Section 28 was repealed. You still had the same people in decision making who had been in decision making processes in museums the day before. They have learned that it is not safe to talk about this. They have learned that schools will not be allowed to come if they do this, and it takes time to unlearn that. In terms of what I know about who was doing this work, there was a lot of pushback, particularly in local council-funded museums, when people tried to do this work in the early 2000s after Section 28, and that did cause harm. And again, just being honest about that people were afraid to try. I think it's a more difficult conversation because it's more nuanced than just there was a law. It's people had the law inside their head and they hadn't had a chance to kill that law yet. So, yeah, absolutely, you're right. There was a huge boost around the 50th anniversary for decriminalisation. That's real. That is a huge upsurge, and I think, just be honest, you know, that's not great that it took until 2017 for the industry to feel collectively, obviously people were doing this work before on a smaller scale, but like collectively safe and comfortable doing this work until 2017. That's not good, and it's okay to just say that. That's where I go with it when people ask what happened next.
Thank you very much. There's one here.
Thank you. That was an absolutely barnstorming talk. What would you say to a museum who said to you, we have no LGBTQIA content in our collections?
Yes, you do, is the first thing I would say. Again, I would kind of go, and so I think I'll think about this from the two kinds of museums where I can think about this happening the most are STEM-related collections, you think about, and with those I would sort of think about whose stories are we telling and what were these people creating. If you're talking about computing, obviously Alan Turing is the go-to that everyone goes to. But there are other examples, and if we think about medical history, HIV history is queer history, is disabled history, and that is vital to talk about as both of those things. And with social history collections, it takes research, and that's kind of a bit exhausting sometimes, but every community has queer history. Every community, most of the cities that have had railway stations in the Victorian era have a gay village that existed within 200 to 500 meters of a railway terminus. You can find that on maps. It takes the will to do the research, and sometimes it takes the funding to do the research, and obviously that is a limiting factor. And again, with the question about being honest about with your audiences about what happened next, funding is also critical to talk about. It's never comfortable to talk about funding with an audience, but who's paying for the research to happen, who's paying for the exhibitions to be put on, it is important that people understand that's how museums work. With a social history collection, I would also think about just your friends and neighbours, your gran. There are queer people everywhere, and they might not have been big and shiny and famous, but they were there, and you can find them. You can find them through pattern recognition, and that's something that I think as an industry we're scared of doing with queerness, because there's still a perception that it's offensive. And I'm making eye contact with Margaret Middleton, who has written about this, about queer possibilities. So, we go to galleries and we can see that there is queerness on the walls as queer people, and we know that you are not telling these stories, and we want to know why. And often the why is fear, and the why is sometimes also discrimination. It's always discrimination to not have your story told, but actively chosen discrimination. You can tell stories about queer people without an object that says, a confessional letter that says, I am queer. You can see the couple, you can see the pairs of women who live together and were buried in the same grave and go, yeah, I don't actually need to have seen them kissing to know that they were in a relationship. I can look at a painting that is so full of longing that was been painted by a man and is of another man and go, this has queer undertones to it. You might not say this was painted by a queer person if you don't know for sure it was painted by a queer person, but you can tell those stories with those objects. Every museum has a queer collection. You just do. And I know you do, obviously, but every museum has one.
Anybody else?
So in 1981, the miners and you've got information linked to the miners. Is that the original stuff that you have in there, or is it replicas or copies?
It's the original. So the banner on the first, the one that's on this slide now, that's a replica that was made for the film Pride. But the one on slide number 1, which I will go back to because I'm so proud of it. Maybe I'll go back to it? Can I? Yes. So the banner that's on display there with Jonathan Blake and Mike Jackson in front of it, that's the original. It's got a painting on the back of it by Mark Ashton. It's gorgeous, and we're super proud of it. We also have their archive.
Who's looked after that all this time?
We have.
The banner's on display now if anyone wants to come and visit.
Any more questions while we've got Jamie here? I've got a question for you. So you're obviously doing incredible stuff up in Manchester at the moment, so congratulations on that. Have you seen anywhere else that you can share with the audience that you thought was particularly well presented?
Ooh. It's put me on the spot because I don't want to insult people by not saying them. I think that there are some some of the trails that I've seen at Liverpool museums have been really, really strong. There's a lot of mixed feelings about trails because it feels very much like take this and go do it yourself rather than active interpretation. I also love the community co-curated labels in art galleries where, the Whitworth, they did Undefining Queer, that is also Manchester, but I'm going to talk about it, you can't stop me. But they did a community co-curated exhibition where the community defined, they made a terminology guide and they chose what was going on display. Most of the Whitworth's collection to that point hadn't had the queerness tagged on it, so that's obviously always a problem. But they went through and they responded to these paintings, they responded to the textiles, and it was also super intersectional. Like, there was like an intentional push for it to be intersectional. Museum of Transology is also doing really amazing work with intersectional collecting and making sure that what they've got on display when they do exhibitions isn't just telling the same stories about white, binary, British nationals, trans people. So their exhibition has just closed, but whenever they go on tour with it, I would really encourage people to go to that and have a look and see how these stories are told in that gallery. They're also told by, like, the object labels are written by the people that donated the objects, and that's something that is really, really cool. And I would encourage other museums to think about, if you're doing contemporary collecting from marginalised communities, let people write in their own voices. You might also provide interpretation additional to that, but when someone's allowed to tell their story in their own voice, they have more of an understanding of them being a part of the museum and a part of the collection than if you just give something and then go away.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to draw the session to a close now. So thank you to Olivia and to Scott for the BSL interpreting and for the really interesting talk session by Jamie. Thank you. You should